I'm your Huckleberry. Those three words, delivered by Val Kilmer with an ivory-handled Colt gleaming in his hand, became one of the most iconic moments in Western film history. Doc Holliday, dying from tuberculosis, facing down Johnny Ringo in the trees outside Tombstone. The gun spinning effortlessly. The shot. The legend. But here's something that'll surprise you. Some of those iconic guns you remember? Pure Hollywood fiction. And some of the ones that look too fancy to be real? Those are actually historically perfect. The twist is figuring out which is which. See, Tombstone did something remarkable back in 1993. It got more of the guns right than just about any Western before it. But the ones it got wrong? Those became the legends we all remember. And sometimes, the gun that looks the most authentic is the biggest lie on screen. Now, before we dive into this, I need to tell you about a man named Peter Sherayko. You've seen him in the movie playing Texas Jack Vermillion, but what you might not know is that he owned over 1,300 period firearms, 650 gun belts, and a library of 5,000 books on Western culture. This guy wasn't just an actor. He was the film's armorer, the man responsible for every gun you see on screen. When director George Cosmatos said he wanted historical accuracy, Sherayko took that personally. He didn't hand Kurt Russell a random Colt and call it a day. He tracked down the actual gun that Sheriff Johnny Bean carried in 1881 and bought it at auction for the film. That's dedication. But even with someone like Sherayko running the armory, perfect historical accuracy isn't always possible. Sometimes the records conflict, sometimes the truth doesn't look as dramatic on camera, and sometimes the legend is just too powerful to ignore. Today, we're going through 15 actual firearms from Tombstone. We'll separate fact from fiction, myth from history, and by the end, you'll see that famous gunfight scene in a completely different light. Because the truth? It's actually more interesting than the legend. Let's start with the biggest myth in Western movie history. When Wyatt Earp pulls out that massive long-barreled Colt revolver at Iron Springs and starts blasting away at Curly Bill Brocious, you're watching one of cinema's most beautiful lies. The Buntline Special. A Colt Single Action Army with a 12-inch barrel, supposedly made by Colt and presented to Wyatt Earp by dime novelist Ned Buntline as thanks for providing stories about the Wild West. In Tombstone, it's kept in a velvet-lined case in Wyatt's drawer, treated like some kind of Excalibur of the frontier. Here's the problem. This entire story is a Hollywood invention. This myth was created by a man named Stuart Lake in his 1931 biography, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. Lake claimed that Buntline commissioned 5 special long-barreled Colts and presented them to various lawmen, including Wyatt Earp. The story was perfect, too perfect. Because when researchers started digging through records, they found absolutely no evidence that this presentation ever happened. Ned Buntline did travel west, but only once, in 1869. At the time, Lake claimed Buntline gave Wyatt this gun in Dodge City. Wyatt wasn't even in Dodge. He was in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, panning for gold. Even better, he was actually under indictment for murder in Dodge City at that very moment. Kinda hard to receive a commemorative pistol when you're wanted by the law in that town. But Lake's book became wildly popular. It turned Wyatt Earp into a legend, and the Buntline Special became part of American mythology. By the 1950s, Colt was actually manufacturing revolvers they called Buntline Specials because the name had become so famous. Television shows like The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp prominently featured the long-barreled revolver. These days, companies like Cimarron Firearms sell replicas of the gun Kurt Russell used in Tombstone, complete with engravings commemorating the film. The gun has even spawned a collector's market. People pay thousands of dollars for Colt Buntline reproductions that never would have existed if Stuart Lake hadn't invented the whole story in the first place. That's how powerful a good myth can be. So why did the filmmakers include it? Because by 1993, the Buntline Special was part of the Earp legend. Audiences expected to see it. To leave it out would have felt wrong, even though including it was historically inaccurate. The velvet case, the careful way Wyatt removes it, the almost ceremonial presentation of this weapon, it's all Hollywood theater built on a foundation of historical fiction. Historical accuracy rating, completely fictional, 0 out of 10. Now let's talk about what historical evidence strongly suggests Wyatt Earp used on October 26, 1881. While Hollywood loves showing Wyatt with a Colt, multiple independent sources point to a different story. Testimony from the legal hearing after the gunfight, combined with statements Wyatt made to his biographer, indicate that he most likely carried a Smith Wesson Model 3 American. Not in a holster on his hip like you see in the movies, but tucked away in the pocket of his coat. The Smith Wesson Model 3 was the first large-caliber American revolver designed for metallic cartridges. While Colt was still making cap and ball revolvers that needed conversion, Smith & Wesson had the patent rights to rear-loading cylinders. This gave them a huge advantage. Here's what made the Model 3 special. It was a top-break design. You'd press a latch, the barrel would hinge down, and a star-shaped extractor would pop out all once empty cartridge cases at once. Compare that to a Colt Single Action Army, where you had to open a loading gate, rotate the cylinder, and poke out each spent case one at a time with an ejector rod. In a gunfight, speed matters. The Model 3 could be reloaded in seconds. That's why so many lawmen and outlaws preferred it over the Colt. Jesse James carried one, Billy the Kid had one, Pat Garrett used one. According to multiple historical accounts, Tombstone's mayor John Clum gave Wyatt a Smith & Wesson new Model 3 as a gift just days before the OK. Corral gunfight. It was chambered in .44 S&W Russian with an 8-inch barrel. Wyatt carried it in an overcoat pocket, which was common for lawmen at the time. They wanted their guns concealed but accessible. During the subsequent court hearing, Wyatt testified about carrying his revolver in his overcoat pocket. He also told his biographer John Henry Flood that he used the Smith & Wesson that John Clum had given him. So here's the irony. The most historically accurate gun Wyatt Earp could have carried in the movie Tombstone is one that barely appears on screen. There's a brief scene where Kurt Russell wears a Smith & Wesson Model 3 while courting his future wife, but during the actual gunfight, he's got that Colt. Why? Because the Colt Single Action Army became iconic. It's what audiences expect to see. The Smith & Wesson, despite being more advanced and more historically accurate, just doesn't have the same visual impact. Historical accuracy rating. 100% accurate for the actual gunfight, but Hollywood couldn't resist the Colt. While we're talking about the Smith & Wesson Model 3, let's look at Virgil Earp's gun. Sam Elliott carries a stunning nickel-plated Smith & Wesson new Model 3 with pearl grips throughout the film. It gleams in every scene, this beautiful piece of craftsmanship that looks almost too fancy for the dusty streets of Tombstone. And here's the remarkable thing. Virgil probably did carry something very much like this. Virgil Earp had a reputation for favoring the latest Smith & Wesson revolvers. As the town marshal and deputy U.S. Marshal, he could afford quality firearms. The nickel finish wasn't just for show, it was practical. Nickel plating resisted rust and corrosion better than blued steel, which mattered in the dry, dusty Arizona territory. Pearl grips were expensive, but they were also popular among lawmen who wanted to project authority. This wasn't vanity. In a town full of armed cowboys and miners, looking professional and well-equipped was part of the job. The new Model 3 was introduced in 1878, which means it was cutting-edge technology in 1881. Virgil, as a lawman who took his job seriously, would have wanted the best equipment available. The film actually nails this detail. When Sam Elliott draws that nickel-plated revolver, he's carrying exactly the kind of gun a professional lawman would have chosen in that era. It's not just Hollywood glamour. It's historical accuracy that happens to look great on camera. Historical accuracy rating, highly accurate, 9 out of 10. Bill Paxton's Morgan Earp carries his own Colt Single Action Army throughout the film, and while it doesn't get as much screen time as Wyatt's or Virgil's guns, it deserves recognition for being historically appropriate. Morgan, the youngest of the Earp brothers involved in the gunfight, was appointed as a special policeman to assist his brother Virgil. Historical records indicate Morgan did carry a Colt revolver during the OK Corral confrontation, though the specific details about barrel length and finish are lost to time. What we know about Morgan suggests he was more of a working lawman than his brothers. He wasn't as polished as Virgil or as legendary as Wyatt. His gun reflects that. It's a standard Colt, likely blued rather than nickel-plated, without the fancy grips or custom work that characterized his brother's weapons. The film portrays Morgan as enthusiastic, loyal, and perhaps a bit less experienced than his older brothers. His more utilitarian revolver fits that characterization. It's not about showing off, it's about having a reliable tool for a dangerous job. During the actual gunfight, Morgan was shot and wounded but survived, only to be assassinated later in a revenge attack by the Cowboys. The Colt he carried that day has never surfaced in historical collections, unlike the various guns claimed to have belonged to Wyatt or Virgil. Historical accuracy rating: period correct and character appropriate, 8 out of 10. Now let's talk about the man who stole the movie, Doc Holliday. Val Kilmer's portrayal of Doc is legendary, and a big part of that legend is the guns he carries. In the film, Doc has a Colt Model 1877 Lightning double-action revolver in a shoulder holster, and depending on the scene, sometimes a Thunderer as well. Both guns are nickel-plated with ivory grips, and they're absolutely beautiful. The Lightning was chambered in .38 caliber, while the Thunderer was chambered in .41. They look nearly identical externally, both using the same double-action mechanism. What made them special was that they were double-action. You could pull the trigger and the gun would fire without having to manually cock the hammer first. This made them faster to shoot than single-action revolvers like the Peacemaker. The Colt Lightning and Thunderer were introduced in 1877, which means they were relatively new technology in 1881. Now here's where it gets interesting. We know Doc Holliday was involved in a shooting in October 1880, a year before the OK Corral gunfight. During that incident, he shot saloon owner Milt Joyce and Joyce's bartender with what contemporary newspaper accounts described as a self-cocker. That's old-timey language for a double-action revolver. Witnesses also noted that Doc used a nickel-plated revolver during the famous gunfight. In Stuart Lake's controversial but sometimes accurate biography, he quotes Wyatt Earp as saying that Doc carried a nickel-plated Colts, which was for years his favorite weapon. So while we can't point to a specific serial number and say this is definitely the gun Doc carried, the evidence strongly suggests he favored nickel-plated double-action Colt revolvers. Lightning or Thunderer would fit that description perfectly. The film also shows Doc wearing the revolver in a shoulder holster, which is historically plausible for a gambler and dentist. Doc spent most of his time sitting at gambling tables, and a shoulder rig would have been more comfortable than a hip holster for someone in his profession. There's one detail the movie adjusts for visual impact. The real Doc Holliday reportedly preferred longer-barreled revolvers, typically 7.5 inches. The ones Val Kilmer carries have 4 3/4-inch barrels, which look better on camera and make the gun handling sequences more dynamic. A shorter barrel made the gun easier to draw and more comfortable to carry concealed, but Doc apparently liked the extra accuracy and presence of a longer barrel. It's a small compromise between historical accuracy and cinematic practicality. Historical accuracy rating: highly likely. 8 out of 10 for the type of guns, but minus points for the barrel length. In addition to his Lightning and Thunderer, Doc also carries a Colt Single Action Army on his hip in several scenes. This one's also nickel-plated with ivory grips, creating a matched set. The Colt SAA, also called the Peacemaker, was the most common revolver in the American West. Introduced in 1873, it became the standard by which all other revolvers were judged. It was reliable, powerful, and could take a beating. Doc carrying one makes perfect sense. Having multiple guns meant you had more shots before reloading, which could make the difference between living and dying in a gunfight. And mixing his fast double-action revolvers with a deliberate single-action Colt gave him options: fast shots from the Lightning or Thunderer, more carefully aimed fire from the Colt if needed. The historical record confirms Doc did carry and use Colt revolvers. We just don't know the exact models. What we do know is that he preferred nickel plating and quality firearms. As a dentist, even one dying of tuberculosis and reduced to gambling for a living, Doc had been a gentleman. He maintained that image through his clothing and his weapons. Historical accuracy rating: correct type of gun, 7 out of 10. Now we come to the most historically accurate weapon in the entire film, Doc Holliday's shotgun. In the movie, as the Earps are preparing to confront the Cowboys, Virgil trades Doc his walking cane for a 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun. Doc carries it under his long coat as they walk down Fremont Street toward the vacant lot. When the shooting starts, Doc uses that shotgun to blow Tom McClory clean off his feet. This is almost exactly what happened in real life. On October 26, 1881, Chief of Police Virgil Earp stopped by the Wells Fargo office in Tombstone and borrowed a shotgun. He then gave it to Doc Holliday to carry during the confrontation. When the shooting started, Doc fired that shotgun and killed Tom McClory, who was using his horse for cover, multiple Sul. Witnesses testified to seeing Doc with a shotgun. The weapon was never returned to Wells Fargo and disappeared after the gunfight. For over a century, nobody knew what happened to it. In the early 1900s, a shotgun surfaced that Wyatt Earp claimed was the one Doc used. What made it interesting was that the trigger mechanism had been modified so both barrels would fire simultaneously. That's a massive amount of recoil, like getting hit in the shoulder with a sledgehammer, but it would guarantee that your target went down. The detail about it being a 10 gauge is significant. Gauge refers to the bore diameter of the shotgun. The smaller the number, the bigger the bore. A 12 gauge is common for hunting. A 10 gauge is substantially larger and more powerful. Cowboys at the time called shotguns street howitzers because of their devastating effect at close range. Wyatt Earp himself used that exact phrase. Now, here's where historical accuracy gets murky. Some evidence suggests the shotgun might have been hammerless, which was cutting-edge technology in 1881. But most depictions, including in Tombstone, show a traditional hammer-fired design. We honestly don't know for sure. What we do know is that Doc was weak from tuberculosis. He weighed about 130 pounds and was slowly dying. Some historians have questioned whether he would have regularly carried a heavy 10-gauge shotgun because of the brutal recoil. But for one specific confrontation, knowing he was walking into a gunfight, yeah, he'd have carried it despite the weight and the kick. The movie even gets the smaller details right. Doc doesn't use the shotgun in a gambler's shoulder rig like he might have if it were truly his weapon. Virgil hands it to him right before they leave. It's borrowed, temporary, just for this fight. Historical accuracy rating, nearly perfect, 9.5 out of 10. The Colt Single Action Army appears in the hands of almost every character in Tombstone. Wyatt's got one, Morgan's got one, the Cowboys all have them. It's the default revolver of the Old West, at least in Hollywood's imagination. And here's the thing. This is actually pretty accurate. The Colt SAA was introduced in 1873 and quickly became the most popular revolver in America. The U.S. Army adopted it as their standard sidearm. Cowboys bought them. Lawmen carried them. Outlaws stole them. By 1881, the Colt Single Action Army was everywhere. It was chambered most commonly in .45 Colt, a powerful cartridge that could drop a man or a horse. The standard military barrel length was 7.5 inches, though you could order shorter barrels for civilian use. 4 3/4 inches became popular for concealed carry. Longer barrels, like the artillery model's 5.5 inches or the cavalry model's 7.5 inches, were favored by people who wanted accuracy and stopping power. The gun operated on a simple principle. Pull the hammer back, pull the trigger, the gun fires. Unlike that fast-loading Smith Wesson top brake we discussed earlier, the Colt required you to open the loading gate, rotate the cylinder, and use the ejector rod to poke out each spent cartridge one at a time. It was slower, but it was also incredibly rugged. You could drop a Colt SAA in the dirt, kick it, submerge it in water, and it would still fire. That reliability made it the weapon of choice for people whose lives might depend on their gun working every single time. In the movie, Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and most of the other cowboys carry Colt Single Action Army revolvers. This is historically accurate. The cowboys were ranch hands, and the Colt was the working man's gun. It was affordable, reliable, and powerful enough for ranch work or intimidation. During the actual OK Corral gunfight, we know the cowboys were armed with Colt revolvers. Exactly which models and barrel lengths. The historical record gets fuzzy. But Colts? Absolutely. The film shows a variety of finishes, blued steel, nickel plating, different grip materials. This is also accurate. Colt offered extensive customization. You could get your gun exactly how you wanted it, assuming you had the money. Historical accuracy rating. 100% accurate. 10 out of 10 for the most common gun of the era being the most common gun in the film. Michael Biehn's Johnny Ringo deserves special attention because his gun setup was no accident. In the film, Ringo carries a nickel-plated Colt Single Action Army with ivory grips and a 4 3/4 inch barrel. Sound familiar? It's almost identical to what Doc Holliday carries. This was a deliberate choice by the filmmakers and armorer Peter Sherayko. The idea was to show that Ringo and Doc were equals, mirror images of each other, same style of gun, same deadly skill, same fast draw technique. When they finally face off in that memorable showdown, the point is driven home. It's not the gun that matters, it's the man behind it. Historically, we know Johnny Ringo did carry Colt revolvers. According to period accounts, he favored longer-barreled guns, typically 7.5 inches, which was standard for serious gunfighters of the era. The longer barrel gave better accuracy at distance and more stopping power. Michael Biehn trained extensively with his revolver for 7 months before filming. Unlike most actors who practice with rubber prop guns, Biehn worked with a real functioning Colt because Sherayko believed that only by handling an actual firearm would Biehn develop the authentic gun handling skills needed for the role. That dedication shows in every scene where Ringo handles his weapon. The matching of Doc's and Ringo's guns is Hollywood symbolism, but it's built on a foundation of historical truth. Both men would have carried quality firearms, both would have maintained them meticulously, and both would have chosen guns that reflected their image as dangerous, skilled professionals. Historical accuracy rating. Correct type and finish, but like Doc's, the barrel is shorter than historical preference. 7 out of 10. When Johnny Ringo shows up in Tombstone, he's carrying a Winchester Model 1876 rifle. So are several other Cowboys. The Winchester 76, also called the Centennial Model because it was introduced during America's 100th birthday celebration, was a lever-action repeating rifle designed for larger, more powerful cartridges than earlier Winchesters. The Model 1873 Winchester had been chambered in pistol calibers like .44-40. It was perfect for small game or defense hunts, but it lacked the power for big game hunting. Buffalo hunters and frontiersmen wanted something more substantial. Winchester responded with the Model 1876, which could handle cartridges like the .45-75, .45-60, and .50-95 Express. These were real rifle rounds with serious stopping power. The .45-60, which was one of the more common chamberings, earned the nickname Montana Bear Gun because it had enough power to stop a grizzly. In Africa and India, hunters used the .50-95 Express version for dangerous game. Famous users of the Winchester 1876 included a young Theodore Roosevelt, who took his on hunting trips out west before he became president. The Texas Rangers carried them. The Canadian Northwest Mounted Police used them as standard issue. Even Geronimo had one when he surrendered in 1886. And yes, Johnny Ringo reportedly carried a Winchester 1876. In the film, we see Ringo and other cowboys using these rifles during various scenes, including the big shootout at Iron Springs. The Winchester 76 was absolutely available in 1881 and would have been a natural choice for cowboys who needed a powerful, reliable rifle for ranch work or more violent pursuits. The movie shows them using the rifles the way they would have been used, carried in saddle scabbards on horseback, used for long-range shooting. The only slight historical quibble is that during the actual OK Corral gunfight, the cowboys had left their rifles with their horses at a nearby stable. They only used handguns during the famous 30-second shootout, but for the broader events before and after the gunfight, the Winchester 1876 is perfect. Historical accuracy rating, highly accurate for the time period and the characters, 9 out of 10. While Doc's borrowed Wells Fargo 10-gauge was a specific historical weapon, the cowboys throughout Tombstone carry their own double-barreled 12-gauge shotguns. Billy Clanton loads one during the opening scene. Curly Bill uses one at Iron Springs. Ike Clanton has one at different points. These weren't fancy weapons like Doc's. They were working guns, the kind you'd find on any ranch or in any rural home in America during the 1880s. A double-barreled shotgun was simple and devastatingly effective. 2 barrels, 2 triggers, 2 shots. Break open the action, eject the spent shells, load 2 fresh ones. You could fire both barrels at once if you were desperate or crazy enough to handle the recoil. For close-range work, nothing beat a shotgun, a load of buckshot spread out as it traveled, which meant you didn't need precise aim. Point in the general direction and pull the trigger. At room distance, a shotgun was absolutely lethal. They were also cheap and commonly available. Winchester, Parker, Remington, and dozens of smaller manufacturers made double-barreled shotguns. A working cowboy could afford one. Many homes had them for hunting or protection. In Tombstone, the shotguns serve a storytelling purpose. They mark the difference between the relatively civilized lawmen with their revolvers and the rougher cowboys with their pragmatic, brutal weaponry. But this isn't just Hollywood symbolism. It's rooted in historical reality. Cowboys and ranchers did favor shotguns for practical reasons. If you're riding the range and come across a coyote or need to put down an injured cow, a shotgun is more versatile than a rifle. If you're planning violence, the intimidation factor of a shotgun is hard to beat. The film shows these shotguns being shortened, with barrels cut down for easier handling. This was common practice and legal at the time. A shorter barrel made the gun faster to bring into action and easier to carry on horseback. Historical accuracy rating. Completely accurate. 10 out of 10 for common weapons being commonly shown. There's a scene early in Tombstone where Billy Bob Thornton's character, Johnny Tyler, approaches Wyatt Earp with a massive 10-gauge shotgun. He's trying to intimidate Wyatt and get him to leave the Oriental Saloon. Virgil casually picks up the shotgun after Johnny puts it down. Later, we see this same shotgun mounted under Wyatt's faro table as a hidden weapon when Johnny Ringo harasses Doc Holliday. This is a Belgian-made Meteor 10-gauge side-by-side shotgun with a distinctive monoblock breech. Now, here's where things get interesting from a historical accuracy standpoint. The monoblock breech design, where the barrel breech and action face are machined from a single piece of steel, was invented by Belgian gunmaker Henri Piper in 1881. Piper then licensed this design to Remington. The thing is, this innovation happened in 1881, the exact year the film takes place. Would Wyatt Earp have had access to this cutting-edge Belgian technology on the Arizona frontier just months after it was invented? Probably not. Imported firearms took time to reach the American West, especially a mining town like Tombstone that was, despite its growth, still relatively remote. But is it possible? Technically, yes. Wealthy individuals could special order firearms from Europe. Given Tombstone's status as a booming silver town with connections to San Francisco and other major cities, high-end imported goods did make their way there. The movie uses this gun for dramatic effect. That massive 10-gauge under the table is a statement about Wyatt's preparedness and his willingness to use overwhelming force. It's also a subtle show of sophistication. This isn't just any shotgun, it's an expensive European piece. From a pure historical accuracy standpoint, this is questionable. The timing is technically possible, but unlikely. However, compared to the completely fictional Buntline Special, having a rare imported shotgun is a minor liberty. Historical accuracy rating. Technically possible, but unlikely. 5 out of 10. In several scenes, Texas Jack Vermillion and Turkey Creek Jack Johnson carry Whitney Kennedy rifles. These lever-action rifles look similar to Winchesters, but were made by the Whitney Arms Company, which was trying to compete with Winchester's dominance of the repeating rifle market. The Whitney Kennedy was introduced in 1879, which means it was available during the Tombstone era. It used a lever action similar to Winchester designs, but had some unique features. Most were chambered in .44-40, the same cartridge as the Winchester 1873. Here's the reality. Whitney Kennedy rifles were never as popular as Winchesters. Winchester had the market cornered, the brand recognition, and the superior distribution network. Whitney made quality guns, but they were fighting an uphill battle. So why include them in the movie? 2 reasons. First, they did exist, and some people did carry them, so having a couple in a film full of various firearms adds historical texture. Second, and this is pure speculation, having the actors carry slightly different rifles helps the audience distinguish between characters in chaotic action scenes. Were the real Texas Jack Vermillion and Turkey Creek Jack Johnson carrying Whitney Kennedy rifles during the Earp Vendetta ride? We don't know. The historical record doesn't specify exact firearms for these supporting characters, but they could have been. Whitney Kennedy rifles were available, they were functional, and some people preferred them to Winchesters for various reasons. It's a small detail, but it shows the level of thought Peter Sherayko put into arming the film. He didn't just hand everyone the same Winchester Model 1873 and call it authentic. He mixed in variations that would have existed at the time. Historical accuracy rating. Accurate, but uncommon. 7 out of 10. Sharp-eyed viewers will notice that some characters in Tombstone carry Remington Model 1875 revolvers instead of Colts. These appear primarily with minor characters and background extras, but they're there. The Remington Model 1875 was introduced as a direct competitor to the Colt Single Action Army. Remington saw how successful Colt's design was and wanted a piece of that market. The Remington 1875 was similar in operation, a single-action revolver chambered in the same calibers as the Colt, but it had a different look. The most notable visual difference was the web under the barrel where the ejector rod mounted. Remington's design was more substantial and enclosed compared to Colt's more delicate-looking rod housing. Remington also offered unique features like a lanyard ring for military use. The Remington never achieved the popularity of the Colt, but it had its adherents. Some people preferred the Remington's slightly different balance and grip angle. It was also sometimes cheaper to buy, which mattered to cowboys and miners working on limited budgets. In the context of 1881 Tombstone, seeing Remington revolvers would be entirely normal. They were available, they were functional, and they were a legitimate alternative to the more expensive Colt. The film uses these guns primarily for variety. In a movie with dozens of armed characters, having everyone carry identical Colts would be both historically inaccurate and visually boring. By mixing in Remingtons, Smith Wessons, and other period-correct firearms, the armorer created a more authentic representation of what a frontier town's arsenal would actually look like. Historical accuracy rating, period correct and appropriately used, 8 out of 10. Let's talk about a few other firearms that appear briefly in Tombstone and whether they pass the historical accuracy test. There's a scene where Virgil Earp posts a notice banning the carrying of guns within Tombstone's city limits. A citizen protests while holding what appears to be a Kentucky flintlock rifle. This is actually brilliant historical accuracy. In 1881, there were plenty of old flintlock firearms still around. A Kentucky long rifle from the 1820s or 1830s would be 50 years old, which sounds ancient until you realize that's like someone today keeping a rifle from the 1920s. These old guns still worked, and many people kept them for sentimental reasons or because they couldn't afford new cartridge firearms. Having an old-timer protest with a flintlock is both historically plausible and symbolically perfect. He's representing the old order, the older generation, with outdated technology, protesting the new laws that represent civilization encroaching on frontier freedom. Now, let's address something that bothers people who haven't watched carefully. Doc Holliday's famous 3 shots from a double-barrel shotgun during the OK Corral gunfight scene. This isn't actually a mistake. The film shows the same shot from multiple angles. Doc fires both barrels at Tom McLaury. The editing cuts to different perspectives to extend the scene and show the chaos from multiple viewpoints. Some people see this quick cutting and think Doc magically fired 3 times from a 2-shot gun. He didn't. It's just creative cinematography showing the same moment from different angles. This is a technique used throughout the gunfight to make a 30-second historical event feel longer and more dramatic on screen. The guns in Tombstone range from perfectly accurate to deliberately mythological. But even the inaccuracies serve a purpose, telling the story audiences expect while staying true to the spirit of the Old West. Historical accuracy rating. The anachronisms that exist are either intentional, the Buntline, or so minor. They don't matter, 8 out of 10 overall. So here's what we've learned. Tombstone is one of the most historically accurate Western gun movies ever made, but it's accurate in a complicated way. The guns that matter most to the actual historical event, the Smith Wesson revolvers, Doc's shotgun, the Colt Single Action Army revolvers, are portrayed correctly. The things that are wrong are usually wrong because the myths have become more powerful than the truth. The Buntline Special never existed, but it's part of the Wyatt Earp legend now. You can't tell his story without acknowledging it, even if you're acknowledging a lie. Peter Sherayko's obsession with authenticity shows in the details. The variety of firearms reflects what you'd actually see in an 1880s frontier town. Rich men had fancy nickel-plated guns with ivory grips, Working cowboys had practical, beat-up Colts and shotguns. Lawmen carried a mix of the latest technology and reliable standards. Even the minor choices, like including Whitney Kennedy rifles and Remington revolvers, show someone who cared about getting it right. The irony is that Hollywood finally created a Western where most of the guns were historically accurate, and audiences barely noticed because we'd been conditioned by decades of Westerns that got everything wrong. We expect to see Wyatt Earp with a Colt because that's what we've always seen, even though he carried a Smith Wesson. We expect short barrels because they look cooler, even though longer barrels were standard. What Tombstone did was split the difference. They kept the myths where the myths were essential to the story, the Buntline Special, the shorter barrels, but they got right the things that actually mattered to the people who care about historical accuracy. If you're a casual viewer, you see a great Western with memorable guns. If you're a gun historian, you notice the Smith & Wesson New Model 3s, the period-correct shotguns, and the Winchester 1876 rifles, and you appreciate the effort. Our armorer Sherayko later wrote a book called Tombstone, The Guns and Gear, documenting every firearm used in the production. It became a collector's item itself, showing the level of detail that went into arming the film. He didn't just pull random period revolvers from his collection. He researched individual characters, found guns they actually carried when records existed, and filled in gaps with weapons appropriate to each person's status and profession. That level of dedication is rare in Hollywood. The real OK Corral gunfight lasted about 30 seconds and involved roughly 30 shots. 3 men died, 3 were wounded. The guns they used were mostly ordinary, common revolvers and a borrowed shotgun. There was nothing magical about the weapons themselves. The legend came from the men, the moment, and the clash between law and chaos that defined the American frontier, Tombstone. The film understands this. It gives us legendary guns for legendary moments because that's what cinema demands. But it also gives us enough historical truth that when you dig into the details, you find something real underneath the Hollywood polish. And that shotgun Doc carried, the one that killed Tom McLaury, that was real. The Buntline Special that Wyatt used to shoot Curly Bill, that was a beautiful lie. But you know what? Both guns are now part of the same legend. One came from history, the other from mythology, and in the end, they're both equally embedded in how we remember the Wild West. Sometimes the truth is more interesting than the legend. But sometimes, like with Val Kilmer twirling that ivory-handled lightning and saying, "I'm your Huckleberry," the legend is too perfect to let facts get in the way. That's the magic of Tombstone. It honored history enough to earn respect, but it loved legend enough to entertain. And those guns, both real and imagined, tell both stories beautifully.